The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble steps of the Patterson estate, but inside darkness had already fallen. Margaret stood in the foyer, clutching a single document that would change everything. Behind her, the ornate grandfather clock struck 9, each chime echoing through the hollow silence of what had once been her home. Her husband Richard stood with his arms crossed, his face twisted in contempt. Beside him, his sister Vanessa wore a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The termination letter in Margaret's trembling hands felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. "You're worthless now," Richard said, his voice cold and measured. "What good is a wife who can't even keep a simple office job?" Margaret felt the words cut deeper than any blade could. 23 years of marriage, and it had come to this. She had loved this man since they were both young and hopeful, back when he drove a beat-up sedan and dreamed of making something of himself. She had worked 2 jobs to put him through business school, had celebrated every promotion, every success. And now, after one corporate downsizing, after one pink slip through no fault of her own, he was throwing her away like yesterday's newspaper. "Richard, please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "We can figure this out. I'll find another position. I've already sent out applications." "Applications?" Vanessa scoffed, stepping forward. "Margaret, let's be realistic. You're 52 years old. Who's going to hire you? My brother deserves better than a burden." The words stung. But Margaret had grown accustomed to Vanessa's cruelty over the years. What hurt was the agreement in Richard's eyes. He nodded slowly, as if his sister had spoken some profound truth. "I want you out by noon," Richard said flatly. "Take your personal belongings. Everything else stays. This house is in my name, remember?" Margaret did remember. She remembered suggesting they put both names on the deed when they bought it 15 years ago. She remembered Richard insisting it would be simpler his way. For tax purposes, he'd said. She remembered trusting him completely. The grandfather clock continued its steady rhythm as Margaret climbed the curved staircase one last time. Each step felt like walking through water. In their bedroom, no. His bedroom now. She pulled a small suitcase from the closet. She packed slowly, methodically. Her clothes, her photographs, her mother's jewelry box. The box was simple wood, nothing valuable, just sentimental. Or so Richard thought. Her hands lingered on the jewelry box, and for a moment the faintest smile touched her lips. Inside were her mother's pearls, her grandmother's wedding ring, and buried beneath a false bottom, a letter she had received just 3 weeks ago. A letter she hadn't yet told Richard about. A letter that had arrived from Whitmore, Sterling and Associates, the most prestigious law firm in the state. But no, she thought, not yet. Let him have his moment of triumph. By 11:30, Margaret stood once more in the foyer. Richard and Vanessa were waiting, as if to ensure she actually left. Richard held the door open, his impatience evident in every line of his body. "Margaret," he said, his tone almost bored now. "Before you go, I need you to sign something." Vanessa produced a document from her designer handbag. "Just a formality," she said sweetly. "Releasing any claim to Richard's assets. A clean break, you understand." Margaret looked at the paper, then at Richard. "You want me to sign away everything? After 23 years? You contributed nothing to this household," Richard said. "Your little salary barely covered groceries. Everything we have I built. This is just making it official." For a long moment, Margaret said nothing. Then, with a calmness that surprised even herself, she took the pen and signed her name. She watched Richard's shoulders relax, watched Vanessa's smile widen. They thought they'd won. "Where will you go?" Richard asked, though his tone suggested he didn't particularly care. "I'll manage," Margaret said quietly, lifting her suitcase. "I always do." She walked down those marble steps for what Richard assumed would be the last time. He closed the door before she even reached the sidewalk, and she heard the lock click into place with a finality that echoed in her chest. Margaret stood on the street, the afternoon sun warming her face. Then she did something unexpected. She laughed. Not a bitter laugh, but one of genuine relief. She pulled out her phone and dialed a number she had memorized. "Whitmore, Sterling and Associates," a professional voice answered. "How may I direct your call?" "This is Margaret Patterson. I'd like to speak with Mr. Whitmore, please. He's been expecting my call." 3 months later, the Patterson estate looked different in the autumn light. The leaves had turned gold and red, carpeting the manicured lawn that Richard had always been so proud of. Inside, Richard sat at his desk, staring at a letter that had arrived that morning. His hands shook as he read it for the 3rd time. The law firm of Whitmore Sterling, and associates was informing him that his ex-wife, Margaret Patterson, was the sole heir to the Thornsbury fortune. Her mother, whom Richard had always dismissed as a simple school teacher, had been the estranged daughter of Harrison Thornsbury, the railroad and shipping magnate. Upon his death 2 years ago, the fortune had been tied up in probate and complex legal proceedings. It had just been settled. Margaret had inherited everything, $200 million, and Richard had thrown her out over a lost job that paid $40,000 a year. He read the letter again, focusing on one particular paragraph. It stated that Mrs. Patterson's legal team had reviewed all documents signed during and after the marriage. The paper he'd had her sign, relinquishing claims to his assets, was valid. However, it worked both ways. He had no claim to her inheritance. The document he'd been so eager for her to sign had sealed his fate. The doorbell rang, interrupting his spiraling thoughts. Vanessa let herself in with her spare key. "Richard, did you see the news?" She thrust her phone at him, displaying a Society page article. There was Margaret, photographed at a charity gala, wearing an elegant navy gown, her hair styled beautifully. The caption identified her as philanthropist Margaret Thornsbury Patterson, who had just donated $5 million to fund scholarships for displaced workers seeking retraining. "We need to fix this," Vanessa hissed. "Call her, apologize, tell her it was all a misunderstanding." Richard had already tried. He'd called 17 times. Each call went to voicemail. He'd driven to the address listed for her new residence, a penthouse in the city's most exclusive building. The doorman had politely but firmly informed him that Ms. Thornsbury Patterson had left explicit instructions. He was not welcome. Across town, in her light-filled penthouse, Margaret sat with her lawyer, Mr. Whitmore, a distinguished gentleman in his 60s. "He's been quite persistent," Mr. Whitmore observed, reviewing the log of Richard's attempted contacts. "Are you certain you don't want to respond?" Margaret looked out the window at the city below. "I'm certain," she said softly. "For 23 years I made myself small to make him feel big. I ignored his criticisms, his coldness, the way he and his sister treated me like a servant in my own home. I told myself that love meant sacrifice." She turned back to Mr. Whitmore. "But my mother taught me something before she died. She told me that real love doesn't diminish you. It doesn't make you lesser. She left me this inheritance not just as money, but as a lesson. She wanted me to know my worth." "And do you?" Mr. Whitmore asked gently. "Know your worth?" Margaret smiled, and it was genuine, reaching all the way to her eyes. "I'm learning. Every day I'm learning." She stood and walked to her desk, where a list of charitable organizations waited for her review. She'd already established the scholarship fund. Next, she planned to open a shelter for people experiencing sudden job loss, offering not just housing but training and support. She'd call it Thornsbury House after her mother. "There is one thing I'd like you to do," Margaret said, picking up a pen. "Name it," Mr. Whitmore replied. "I'd like to send Richard and Vanessa each a gift." Mr. Whitmore raised an eyebrow. "A gift?" "Yes," Margaret said, writing a note. "Send them each a donation receipt in their name. I've given money to 3 charities. One supports financial literacy for young couples, one provides counseling for troubled marriages, and one offers rehabilitation programs for people learning to treat others with kindness and respect." Mr. Whitmore chuckled. "That's quite generous of you." "Not generous," Margaret corrected gently. "Hopeful. I hope they learn what I did, that a person's value isn't measured in their paycheck or their usefulness. It's measured in their character, their compassion, their capacity for growth." She paused, looking once more at the city stretched out before her. "Richard threw me out thinking I had nothing. He was wrong. I had everything that mattered. I just didn't realize it yet." As the sun set over the city, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Peace, not the peace of revenge or vindication, but the quiet confidence of someone who had finally come home to themselves. The termination letter that had once seemed like an ending had been a beginning. The door that had closed behind her had opened 1,000 more. And Margaret, who had spent so long making herself smaller, was finally ready to take up space in the world. She was ready to shine.